May 13th, 1943, Camp Atterbury, Indiana. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine wooden barracks as the transport trucks rumbled to a halt. Dust settled in the spring air, carrying with it the scent of fresh-cut lumber and blooming wildflowers from the nearby countryside. Inside the canvas-covered vehicles, 847 Italian prisoners of war sat in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on what lay before them. These were not the concrete cells or barbed wire compounds they had steeled themselves to endure. Instead, rows of newly constructed buildings stretched across manicured grounds, each structure bearing the clean lines of American military efficiency. The sound that would come to define their captivity was not the clang of metal doors or the harsh bark of guards, but the gentle ring of a dinner bell, that simple bronze instrument that would summon them 3 times daily to meals more abundant than many had known in their entire lives. These men, weathered by the North African campaign and bearing the weight of Axis defeat, represented a remarkable chapter in the story of World War II captivity. They were among the 51,000 Italian prisoners of war who would eventually find themselves on American soil, part of a larger population of over 425,000 enemy combatants held in the United States between 1942 and 1946. Their journey to this moment had begun with Mussolini's declaration of war on Britain and France in June 1940, when Italy entered the conflict as Germany's junior partner, driven by dreams of Mediterranean empire and colonial expansion. But the reality of war had proven far different from the rhetoric of fascist propaganda. The Italian military machine, already strained by campaigns in Greece and East Africa, found itself increasingly overwhelmed by the logistical demands of modern warfare. By 1943, as Allied forces pressed their advantage in North Africa, entire Italian divisions found themselves cut off, surrounded, and facing a choice between annihilation and surrender. The men now arriving at Camp Atterbury had made that choice in the deserts of Tunisia, along the rocky coasts of Sicily, or in the mountains of southern Italy. They had expected to face the consequences of defeat in the time-honored tradition of warfare: imprisonment, hardship, and the slow grind of survival until war's end. What they discovered instead challenged every assumption they held about their captors, their fate, and ultimately, about the nature of the societies for which they had been fighting. The dinner bell that rang across Camp Atterbury that first evening was not merely a call to sustenance. It was an invitation to witness American abundance in action. As the prisoners filed into the mess hall, their eyes registered details that contradicted everything fascist propaganda had taught them about their enemies. The tables were set with metal trays and proper utensils. Steam rose from serving stations where uniformed cooks ladled generous portions of meat, vegetables, and bread, white bread, a luxury many had not seen since before the war began. The contrast with their recent experiences was stark and immediate. Giuseppe Torregrossa, captured near Kasserine Pass, would later write to his family, "The Americans feed us better than our own officers fed themselves. There is meat every day, sometimes twice daily. The bread is soft and white, like cake." This was no exaggeration. U.S. Army records from Camp Atterbury show that Italian POWs received 3,500 calories per day, exceeding even the rations provided to American combat troops in some theaters. The menu included fresh vegetables, dairy products, and cuts of beef that represented a caloric intake higher than what most of these men had known even in peacetime Italy. The barracks themselves told an equally compelling story. Each building housed 40 men in conditions that met or exceeded Geneva Convention requirements, but more importantly, provided amenities that surpassed the living standards many prisoners had known as civilians. Electric lighting illuminated each room. Indoor plumbing provided hot and cold running water. Central heating systems maintained comfortable temperatures throughout Indiana's harsh winters. Individual footlockers offered personal storage space, while common areas included recreational facilities and libraries stocked with books in Italian. Private Mario Benedetti, a farmer's son from Calabria, documented his astonishment in a letter smuggled home through Red Cross channels. The beds have real mattresses, not straw. There are electric lights in every room, and the water comes from taps, hot when you want it hot. Even the mayor's house in our village does not have such things. For men who had grown up in rural poverty, where electricity remained an urban luxury and indoor plumbing was the privilege of the wealthy, these accommodations represented a standard of living beyond their previous imagination. This abundance was no accident, nor was it motivated purely by humanitarian concerns. American officials understood that well-treated prisoners could serve multiple strategic purposes. Comfortable POWs were less likely to attempt escapes, more willing to participate in work programs that supported the war effort, and potentially valuable sources of intelligence about Axis military capabilities and morale. But beneath these practical calculations lay something deeper, a conscious demonstration of American values and capabilities. The work assignments available to Italian POWs further reinforced this lesson in American abundance. Those who volunteered for labor details found themselves employed in agricultural operations that showcased the mechanized efficiency of American farming. They operated tractors and combines that could harvest in hours what would have taken days using traditional methods. They worked in food processing facilities where assembly line techniques transformed raw materials into finished products with unprecedented speed and volume. Some found employment in military support roles, maintaining vehicles and equipment that demonstrated American industrial capacity. Camp records indicate that over 85% of Italian POWs voluntarily participated in work programs, earning wages of 80 cents per day that could be spent at camp canteens stocked with cigarettes, candy, and personal items. This participation rate far exceeded that of German prisoners, reflecting both cultural differences and the transformative effect of their treatment. The dinner bell that had first called them to unexpected abundance now marked the rhythm of productive days spent in honest labor, earning wages that many could save to support families back home. The psychological impact of this experience cannot be overstated. Men who had been indoctrinated with fascist ideology about American decadence and weakness found themselves confronting daily evidence to the contrary. The United States, they observed, was not the plutocratic oligarchy described in Mussolini's speeches, but a society capable of extending dignity and opportunity even to its enemies. Luigi Antonelli, a former black shirt from Milan, reflected in his memoirs, "We had been told that Americans were soft, that they had grown weak with luxury and democracy, but we saw that their luxury came from strength, from their ability to produce more than they consumed, to give generously because they possessed abundantly." This realization extended beyond material conditions to encompass American attitudes toward authority and individual dignity. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of fascist Italy or Nazi Germany, American camp administration emphasized practical efficiency over ceremonial deference. Guards treated prisoners with professional courtesy rather than ideological hostility. Camp commanders held regular meetings with prisoner representatives, addressing grievances through established procedures rather than arbitrary decree. The very existence of such procedures contradicted fascist teachings about democratic weakness and disorder. Educational programs offered another window into American values. Camp Atterbury maintained a library with over 2,000 volumes in Italian, including works by authors banned in fascist Italy. Discussion groups explored topics ranging from agriculture to democracy, often led by Italian-American volunteers who served as bridges between cultures. These sessions were voluntary, but attendance was high, driven by genuine curiosity about the society that had so confounded their expectations. Religious freedom provided yet another contrast with their previous experience. Catholic chaplains conducted regular services in Italian, while those of other faiths, or no faith at all, faced no pressure to conform. This respect for individual conscience stood in stark contrast to the enforced uniformity of fascist ideology, where dissent had been discouraged and diversity suppressed. The dinner bell that called prisoners to evening meals also marked the end of days in which they had been free to think, believe, and express themselves within the boundaries of camp security. Medical care at Camp Atterbury exceeded standards many prisoners had known as free men. A fully equipped infirmary staffed by qualified physicians provided treatment for everything from minor injuries to serious illnesses. Dental care, preventive medicine, and mental health support were available to all prisoners regardless of rank or nationality. Giuseppe Marinelli, who suffered from chronic malaria contracted in North Africa, wrote, "The American doctors treat me better than the Italian army doctors ever did. They have medicines we never saw, machines that can see inside the body. They spend time explaining my condition, answering questions. They treat me as a person, not just another sick soldier." As months passed into years, the transformative effects of this experience became increasingly apparent. Letters home, carefully censored but still revealing, began to paint a picture of America that contradicted official Italian propaganda. Families received descriptions of abundance, efficiency, and dignity that stood in stark contrast to wartime deprivation in occupied Italy. Some prisoners began to see themselves not as temporary captives, but as witnesses to an alternative way of organizing society. The dinner bell continued to ring 3 times daily, but its meaning evolved with the prisoner's understanding. No longer simply a call to unexpected abundance, it became a symbol of reliability, of a system that functioned with clockwork precision while maintaining human dignity. American guards might change shifts, commanding officers might be reassigned, but the bell rang punctually, and the meals it announced were consistently plentiful and nutritious. This reliability, this systematic competence, impressed men who had served in armies where supplies were irregular, equipment was inadequate, and promises were frequently broken. The work programs, too, took on deeper significance as prisoners began to understand the principles underlying American industrial organization. They observed that efficiency came not from fear or coercion, but from proper training, adequate equipment, and clear procedures. American supervisors corrected mistakes with instruction rather than punishment. Workers who showed initiative were given additional responsibilities and corresponding recognition. The dignity of labor, a concept often proclaimed but rarely practiced in fascist rhetoric, became a daily reality in American camps. Cultural exchanges enriched this transformation. Italian prisoners organized musical performances featuring traditional songs and folk dances. American guards and administrators attended these events, showing genuine appreciation for Italian culture while sharing their own traditions in return. Baseball games between prisoner, teams, and camp personnel became regular events, with the competitive spirit transcending language barriers and national loyalties. These interactions revealed Americans not as the crude materialists of fascist propaganda, but as individuals capable of friendship, humor, and respect for human dignity regardless of political circumstances. Some prisoners began to study English, motivated by curiosity about the language of their captors and the society it represented. Informal conversation groups developed, with Italian-speaking Americans volunteering to help with pronunciation and grammar. These lessons often evolved into broader discussions about American history, government, and social customs. The principles of democratic governance, explained in practical terms rather than abstract theory, began to make sense to men who had known only authoritarian rule. As 1944 progressed and news from Italy grew increasingly grim, many prisoners faced a troubling realization. They were living better as captives in America than their families were as civilians in war-torn Italy. Letters from home described food shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and the chaos of civil war between fascist loyalists and partisan fighters. The contrast between their own security and their families' suffering created complex emotions: gratitude mixed with guilt, admiration for American abundance tempered by homesickness and worry. The dinner bell that had once summoned them to unexpected plenty now called them to meals they sometimes could not fully enjoy, knowing that their loved ones were hungry. Yet this very knowledge reinforced the lesson of American abundance. The United States could afford to feed its enemies well while simultaneously supporting allies, maintaining massive military forces, and continuing to improve living standards for its own citizens. This was abundance not of hoarded wealth, but of productive capacity, of a system that created more than it consumed. Camp newspapers, published in Italian with American approval, began to reflect this evolving understanding. Articles described American agricultural techniques, industrial processes, and social institutions with growing admiration. Editorials, carefully avoiding overt political statements, nonetheless conveyed a sense that prisoners were witnessing something unprecedented, a form of captivity that rehabilitated rather than punished, that demonstrated strength through generosity rather than through cruelty. The approach of war's end brought new complexities to camp life. Italy's surrender in September 1943 had technically made these men co-belligerents rather than enemies, though their status remained that of prisoners until official repatriation could be arranged. Many faced difficult choices about their future. Some had developed skills and relationships that made them reluctant to leave. Others had absorbed enough of American values to question whether they could readjust to European authoritarianism, even in its post-fascist form. Educational programs expanded during this period, with courses in democracy, economics, and American history designed to prepare prisoners for eventual return to Italy as informed advocates for democratic principles. These were not propaganda sessions, but genuine attempts to share the knowledge and values that had made American abundance possible. The dinner bell now summoned men not just to meals, but to evening lectures and discussions that explored the foundations of free society. As repatriation finally began in 1946, the transformation of these men became fully evident. They returned to Italy carrying more than personal possessions and memories. They brought detailed knowledge of American methods, values, and achievements. Many would play significant roles in Italy's post-war reconstruction, applying lessons learned in American captivity to the rebuilding of their homeland. The techniques of modern agriculture, the principles of democratic governance, the dignity of free labor. All these concepts had been absorbed not through books or lectures, but through daily experience of a society that practiced what it preached. The final dinner bell rang at Camp Atterbury on a crisp October morning in 1946, calling the last Italian prisoners to a farewell breakfast before their journey home. As they filed into the mess hall one last time, many reflected on the irony of their situation. They had come as enemies and captives, expecting punishment and privation. Instead, they had received an education in abundance, democracy, and human dignity that would influence the rest of their lives and, through them, the future of their nation. In the decades that followed, as Italy emerged from the ruins of fascism to become a prosperous democracy, the influence of this experience would be felt in countless ways. Former prisoners became farmers who introduced American agricultural techniques to Italian soil. Others entered politics, carrying democratic principles learned in captivity into the halls of government. Some became businessmen, applying lessons in efficiency and fair dealing to the reconstruction of Italian commerce and industry. The dinner bell of Camp Atterbury had long since fallen silent, but its message echoed through the generations. It had proclaimed not just the abundance of American meals, but the abundance of American principles. The revolutionary idea that enemies could be transformed into friends, that captivity could become education, that strength could be demonstrated through generosity rather than cruelty. In treating their prisoners not as objects of vengeance, but as human beings capable of growth and change, Americans had won a victory more lasting than any battlefield triumph. This was the true genius of American abundance. Not merely the ability to produce more goods than could be consumed, but the wisdom to understand that security comes not from impoverishing one's enemies, but from creating conditions in which former enemies can become partners in prosperity. The Italian prisoners, who had expected harsh captivity and instead found dignity, opportunity, and hope, carried this lesson back to a war-torn continent desperately in need of new models for human organization. The dinner bell rings no more at Camp Atterbury, its buildings long since repurposed or demolished. But in the cafes of Rome, the vineyards of Tuscany, the factories of Milan, its echo can still be heard in the voices of men who learned that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the capacity to create, to nurture, and to transform. They had come as prisoners of war and departed as witnesses to the possibility of a world where abundance and freedom might prevail over scarcity and oppression. In the end, that simple bronze bell had summoned them not just to meals, but to a new understanding of what human society could become when guided by principles of dignity, opportunity, and hope.